But let's start with that reshuffle today. Peter Dutton's new front bench will make for a stronger opposition, and in particular, a stronger opposition to campaign against the Voice. Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price was the obvious choice as Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs. And she'll do a fine job, as Credlin watchers would know. She comes from Yuendumu, was the Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs, has run her own small business, describes herself as a proud Celtic Warlpiri Australian woman, and is just the one to prove to people across Australia that we don't need a constitutionally entrenched Indigenous voice on everything, to everyone, in order to give Aboriginal people a fair go. As well, Dutton's decision to appoint Senator Karen Liddle, an Indigenous woman, a Liberal from South Australia, as Shadow Minister for Child Protection, well, that's a smart move too, given the prevalence of these issues, as the statistics prove, despite the government's spin, in remote Aboriginal communities. But back to the Voice. As is becoming clear from the Parliamentary Committee hearings, and it's quite scandalous, these hearings are so truncated and the whole process is so rushed for something so important. Well, the big issue is, what does this constitutional right to make representations really mean? Pretty clearly, it means the Voice has to be informed in advance of all significant policy changes, given plenty of information about those changes and given time and resources to consider them properly. And then once the Voice has made its representations or given its advice, for that advice to then be looked at carefully by the relevant minister or agency or both. Otherwise, what's the point of having a constitutional right to make representations? But having this right means that the whole process of government will be immensely slower, more complicated and more difficult. There will be a right to make a representation when a brief comes up from a minister's department into the office, floating a new policy idea in the Indigenous portfolio. The right to give advice, well, that'll happen too when the idea makes its way to Cabinet. More advice again if the idea requires funding and the Budget Committee has a view. Another right to look at it all over again when it gets turned into legislation and put into the Parliament. Another right for the Voice to advise when the Parliamentary Legislation Committee takes a look at the bill page by page. More advice again, of course, when the Parliamentary Committee reports handed down and any amendments might eventuate. We'll have to go back to the Voice again when this bill passes the Parliament and the Department then wants to get on with implementing any new laws and policy. Now, that's me just using a very simple case. I've worked through many of these before, of a policy idea working its way all the way through the Parliament to implementation. I know from experience of a whole lot more complicated or urgent issues that comes before the government of the day, where the Voice would be a handbrake. I'll give you a couple. The Lindt siege in Sydney, that's one of the examples. What would have happened if the terrorist in that case was an Aboriginal man or woman? Would the Voice need to have been consulted before we deployed terror police? What about agreeing to host US Marines in Darwin? Would the Voice demand consultation there as well? Now, both are not areas where you would normally think Indigenous advice would be warranted. But because we know so little about how this Voice might operate in practice, and because if it's in the Constitution, it's going to be all-powerful, I don't know anyone could rule out either of these two scenarios being a real possibility. Remember, as Anthony Albanese himself has said, only a brave government could ignore the Voice's advice. And a government, of course, prepared to be taken to the High Court and overruled. Now, I can't think of a better person than Jacinta Nampijinpa Price to highlight all of these problems and to demonstrate that Aboriginal people already have a voice. More than one, 11 strong Aboriginal voices like hers in the Parliament, and that we don't need this new activist voice, which is just going to entrench separatism, the very separatism that's creating all the problems that Australians want to see fixed.